Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. If you've had a long day, hopefully this story will help you slow down, relax, and eventually drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to support the channel. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. All right, get cozy, clear your mind, and let's get started. If you live alone in an old house, I need you to listen to this whole story before you go to bed tonight. Because I ignored the same sound for 20 nights and told myself it was rats. It wasn't rats. I'm an audio engineer. Freelance, mostly home studio work, mixing and mastering for musicians who send me files instead of coming in person. I mention that up front because it matters for what comes later. My ears are trained in a way most people's aren't. I spend entire days isolating a single frequency buried under a dozen others. It's not a superpower. It's just years of very deliberate listening. And it's the reason I noticed something most people would have slept straight through. I bought a farmhouse outside a small town in Vermont, about 2 years before any of this started, over 60 years old. 2 stories of wood frame construction. The kind of place with a low, cramped attic you access through a pull-down hatch and a folding ladder in the hallway ceiling. I'd been up there exactly once since moving in. Briefly, just to confirm the insulation looked fine. I had no reason to think about that space at all. It was just dead air above my ceiling, as far as I was concerned. It was a Tuesday night in late September, around 11:20, and I was in bed reading before sleep, when I heard something directly above me. Not the ordinary creak and settle sound old wood makes, the kind you get used to living in a place this age. This was rhythmic, evenly spaced, a slow, deliberate cadence, something moving from one end of my bedroom ceiling to the other, roughly 1 step every 2 seconds, steady enough that counting along with it felt less like imagination and more like measurement. I lay there, professionally attentive, despite myself, tracking that rhythm, the way I'd track a click track in a mix, too even to be random settling, too slow and paced to be a startled animal bolting across a joist. I told myself, the way anyone would, that it was probably raccoons or mice, common enough in a Vermont farmhouse attic come fall, when smaller animals start looking for somewhere warm to wait out the coming cold. It was a reasonable explanation, and for that first night, I let it be enough. I fell asleep eventually, telling myself I'd get it checked out if it kept happening. I called a local roofer the next morning, a guy named Pete, who'd worked on the place before I bought it, and knew the structure well. He came out that same afternoon, climbed up through the hatch with a flashlight, and spent a solid 20 minutes up there before coming back down, looking mildly unbothered. No droppings, no nests, no gaps, big enough for anything bigger than a mouse to get in, he told me, wiping dust off his hands. Insulation's intact, roof lines sealed up tight. Honestly, my best guess is wood contracting with the temperature swing. Gets a lot colder at night this time of year, and old joists can pop and shift more than you'd think. It was a reasonable, scientific-sounding explanation, and I felt genuinely relieved hearing it. The sound continued for a few more nights after that, but having a plausible cause to attach it to made it easier to stop paying such close attention. 3 nights later, it stopped entirely, and I told myself, with a bit of professional pride, that my ears had probably just been more sensitive than the situation warranted. The occupational hazard of someone who spends all day listening for things other people never notice. I want you to remember how confident I was in that explanation. I want you to remember it because of what I know now that I didn't know then. 20 nights is not how long this had actually been going on. It's only how long it took me to finally start listening. 3 nights of silence turned into a false sense of security I probably held on to longer than I should have. I actually forgot about the whole thing for the better part of a week. Back to my normal routine, mixing tracks late into the evening and falling asleep without giving the ceiling a second thought. Then, on what I'd later count as night 7, it came back. Except different this time. Slower, heavier, and with a new element I hadn't noticed before. After every few steps, a pause. lasting somewhere between 5 and 7 seconds, like something standing perfectly still, listening, before moving again. I couldn't help myself. It's not in my nature to leave an unexplained sound unexamined, not with the tools I have sitting in my own basement studio. I grabbed one of my field recording mics, the kind I use for capturing ambient texture on scoring projects, and set it on my nightstand, running for the better part of an hour. I analyzed the waveform the next morning in the same software I use for mixing. What I saw made my stomach do something uncomfortable. The peaks had a consistency, amplitude, frequency, spacing that matched what you'd expect from an adult human body. Shifting weight across a wooden surface, not the sharp, single, non-repeating pulses you'd get from wood contracting under temperature stress. Thermal creaking doesn't repeat in a cycle. This did. I sat with that for a long moment, then did something I'm almost embarrassed to admit now. I talked myself out of my own findings. My software's built for music, I told myself, not forensic acoustic analysis. It wasn't designed to tell me whether something was human or not, and I was probably reading patterns into noise the same way people see faces in wood grain. I actually laughed a little at myself, at how seriously I'd taken a waveform graph, and closed the software. Night 10. It got worse in a different way. The footsteps stopped directly above my bed and simply didn't move again for over 20 minutes. I lay there completely rigid, eyes open in the dark, staring at a ceiling I couldn't actually see, waiting for the next step that never came. That stretch of silence was worse than any sound had been. It had the specific quality of something waiting, not gone, not resting, just still, in the exact way you go still when you're listening for something yourself. A few nights after that, a new sound joined the footsteps, a soft, slow scratching, moving in short, deliberate lines, and then stopping, like fingertips or nails, dragged carefully across a wooden surface. I didn't have a scientific explanation left for that one. Wood doesn't scratch itself. I called Pete back out for a second look, and this time I brought him more than just a description. I played him a clip of the recording, the scratching sound layered under those slow-paced footsteps. He listened to it twice, frowning in a way that told me he was taking it more seriously than he had the first visit. I went up again anyway, this time with a rodent trap and a small borescope camera he fed into the tightest gaps between the joists. Same result as before, only more thorough. No droppings anywhere, no nesting material, no chew marks on the wiring, nothing living up there that he could find any trace of at all. I don't know what to tell you anymore, he admitted, climbing back down, looking genuinely unsettled for the first time since I'd known him. It's clean up there, cleaner than clean, like nothing's ever been up there at all, let alone whatever's making that sound. That should have scared me more than it did in the moment. Instead, in a strange way, it just made me more determined to solve it myself. I ordered a small infrared camera that week, the battery-powered kind, meant for wildlife monitoring, and mounted it myself on a central beam in the attic, angled to cover the section directly above my bedroom, the same spot where the footsteps always seemed to linger longest. I linked it to an app on my phone, live feed and replay, both available at any hour. The first 2 nights after installing it showed exactly nothing. Dust motes catching the infrared light, drifting slow through the beam. A spider spinning a web in one corner of the frame, undisturbed for 2 full nights. No footsteps, no scratching, nothing at all. I started to genuinely doubt myself during those 2 quiet nights, more than I had at any point before. Maybe this really had all come from stress, a strange, sound-obsessed byproduct of a profession that trains you to hear things other people don't. Manufacturing patterns out of an old house's ordinary creaks, because some part of my brain had simply gotten too good at finding rhythm in noise. I almost wanted that to be true. It would have meant nothing was actually wrong. I want to tell you I held on to that comfortable doubt a little longer. I didn't get the chance. It happened on the 20th night since I'd first heard that sound, at 2:14 in the morning. And I know the exact time, because my phone buzzed hard against the nightstand with a motion alert, jolting me fully awake before I'd even processed what was happening. I opened the app with my hands already unsteady, and what filled the screen made my whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room's actual temperature. Between two of the joists, maybe 10 feet from the lens, was a human shape, moving deliberately, pressed almost flat against the insulation, propelling itself forward on elbows and knees in a way that looked deliberately optimized to make as little noise as possible. Every few feet it paused, and in that pause, I heard, through my phone's tinny speaker, the exact same soft scratching sound I'd recorded days earlier. I want you to understand what I actually saw, because it's the detail I can't stop seeing. Even now, the angle of the head kept the entire face in shadow. Everything except two small, round points of light, reflecting straight back at the camera lens. Eyes, wide open, completely still, looking directly at the camera, as though it knew exactly where the lens was, despite the fact that I'd mounted it deliberately out of sight, tucked against a support beam. In a way I was certain wouldn't be noticeable to anyone who didn't already know to look for it. Everything else, nose, mouth, jaw, stayed swallowed in shadow from the gray insulation around it, and only those 2 points of reflected infrared light stood out clearly against the dark, the specific way an animal's eyes catch a flashlight at night. Except the blink, when it finally came, was slow, deliberate, conscious, in a way no animal's blink has ever looked to me. There was no doubting, watching it, that I was looking at a person. I didn't move. I couldn't have told you, in that moment, whether I was even breathing. My phone stayed pressed close to my face, the only light in the room, my heart slamming hard enough that I could hear it in my own ears over everything else. On the screen, those eyes stayed fixed on the camera, but I understood, lying directly beneath that exact spot, that they were also, functionally, fixed on me. For nearly 4 full minutes, I counted it later in my own heartbeat, because I didn't dare check the time. Nothing moved at all. Then, slowly, the head turned away. The eyes vanished from frame, and the scratching started again, faint and unhurried, moving off toward the far corner of the attic, away from where I lay frozen in my bed, staring up at a ceiling that had never once, until that night, felt like something separating me from anything at all. I didn't move for a long time after the sound faded, long enough that when I finally did, my limbs felt stiff and wrong, like they belonged to someone who'd been lying in the exact same position for hours, instead of minutes. I got up as quietly as I possibly could, grabbed my keys and my phone, and left the house in the middle of the night in nothing but the clothes I'd been sleeping in. I sat in my car in this driveway until the sky started to lighten, engine running for the heat, doors locked, watching my own dark house like it belonged to someone else entirely. I called the police the moment I judged it was a reasonable hour, and they arrived not long after with real flashlights and real numbers behind them. Enough people, finally, that I didn't have to face that hatch alone. They went up with the ladder fully extended, moving carefully through a space so cramped they could only travel by crawling between the joists. Exactly the posture I'd watched on my own screen a few hours earlier. It took them almost 20 minutes to reach the far corner, above my bathroom, and when one of the officers called down, his voice had lost the routine, procedural flatness it started with. They'd found a section where the insulation had been compressed flat, deliberately, enough to fit a person lying on their side. Scattered around it, empty plastic bottles, clearly used for urine, some of them cloudy with age. Old cans of food, several rusted through at the seams. A flattened piece of cardboard, positioned like bedding, pushed up against a ventilation duct. The kind of placement, one officer noted, that would let someone hear sound and even catch a thin edge of light from the bathroom directly below, based on how degraded some of the cans were and how unevenly the dust had settled across different sections of the space, some patches clearly disturbed on a regular basis. others left completely undisturbed. The investigating officers estimated this had been going on for months, far longer than the 20 nights I'd actually been aware of anything at all, which meant there'd been an earlier stretch, possibly weeks or months, during which someone had moved through that space quietly enough that I never once noticed a thing. It was the last detail they found that I still haven't been able to fully sit with. A small hole, drilled cleanly through my bedroom ceiling, carefully camouflaged with paint, matched almost exactly to the drywall around it. Not positioned to look down into the room at all. Positioned directly above my pillow. Built, as far as anyone could tell, only to listen. Whoever it was, he was already gone by the time the police got up there. There was no other way out of that attic. Besides the main hatch I'd always kept an eye on, and none of the house's other cameras had picked up anyone leaving that night. No fingerprints matched anything on file. No name, no identity. Nothing beyond the objects left behind as proof that any of it had actually happened at all. Proof I needed, honestly, because some small part of my mind kept trying in the days after to convince me I'd dreamed the whole thing. I didn't stay in that house another night. I sold it within 2 months, taking a real loss on the sale, just to be free of it as fast as possible, and moved into a modern apartment building with poured concrete ceilings. The first thing I asked the leasing agent, before I'd even looked at the unit itself, was whether there was any accessible crawl space above any of the units. There wasn't. That was the only feature I actually cared about. I still don't sleep without a ceiling fan. Running now, every single night, regardless of season or the temperature. Not for the airflow, for the sound. A low, constant hum, thick enough to bury anything smaller underneath it, so I no longer have to lie awake straining to hear whether something small and deliberate is moving above me. I know the irony of that habit better than anyone could point it out to me. It was my ears, trained and sensitive enough to catch a rhythm. Most people would have slept straight through. That let me find this in the first place. And now I spend every night deliberately drowning that same sensitivity in white noise, because knowing was so much worse than not knowing ever was. There's a version of all this I try to hold on to on calmer days. A deeply troubled, deeply patient man, likely homeless, who'd found an unnoticed way into an old, poorly monitored attic and simply never left, living in near total silence for months at a time, undone eventually only by an unusually attentive set of ears that most people wouldn't have had. Sad and frightening, but at least human, at least explicable within the ordinary boundaries of a person doing something deeply wrong for reasons that don't require anything beyond desperation and isolation. There's another version, quieter, that surfaces on the nights the fan doesn't quite drown out everything. The hole above my pillow, drilled and painted with a care that took real time, real patience, built for the singular purpose of listening to me sleep, night after night, for however long before I ever noticed a single thing. I try not to sit with that second version for very long. For almost a year after I moved, I managed to keep the whole thing in a compartment I mostly didn't open. New apartment, new routine, ceiling fan, running every night without fail. I told myself, cautiously, that distance and time were doing the job they're supposed to do, making the specific edges of it dull slightly, even if the shape of it never fully went away. Then, about 11 months after I sold the house, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and something about the area code, still Vermont, still that same small town, made my stomach tighten before I'd even answered. It was the woman who'd bought the house from me. I remembered her vaguely from the closing. Young couple, first house together, the kind of nervous excitement I recognized because I'd felt it myself 2 years before any of this happened to me. She sounded friendly on the phone, a little apologetic for calling out of nowhere, and it took her a moment to actually get to the reason. "This is going to sound silly," she said, half laughing in that particular way people laugh when they're not entirely sure something is funny. "But have you ever noticed any weird noises up in the ceiling? Like footsteps at night? We've been hearing something lately, Probably just mice, right? I sat there holding the phone for what felt like a very long time before I answered. I thought about telling her everything. I thought about the recordings, the waveform, the eyes in that infrared footage, the hole drilled precisely above where my head used to rest every night. I thought about what it would actually do to her, hearing all of that from a total stranger over the phone, in a house she and her husband had probably already started filling with their own furniture, their own routines, their own sense of safety. Probably mice, I said instead. I didn't explain anything further. She thanked me, a little relieved sounding, and we said a polite goodbye. And I hung up the phone and sat in the dark of my apartment for a long time afterward. Ceiling fan. Turning steadily above me, the only sound in the room. I've turned that phone call over more times than I can count since it happened, trying to decide whether staying quiet was the right thing to do or just the easiest. There's a version of this whole thing I can almost make peace with on calmer nights. That what I experienced really was a singular, isolated event. One deeply disturbed man who found his way into an old, poorly monitored attic and stayed as long as he could go unnoticed, undone eventually, by nothing more mystical than an unusually attentive pair of ears. Under that version, the new owner's footsteps really are just mice, an old house doing what old houses do, and my own imagination, primed by everything I went through, is doing exactly what primed imaginations do when a stranger mentions a coincidence that sounds almost too familiar. There's a version I like less, one that doesn't fully explain itself no matter how long I sit with it, that whoever it was chose that house specifically, for reasons that had nothing to do with me as a person and everything to do with the house itself, its particular attic, its particular access point, its particular proximity to a bedroom below. Under that version, my leaving didn't close anything. It just returned the house to whatever condition made it appealing to him in the first place, waiting patiently for whoever moved in next. I don't have an answer for which version is true. I don't think I ever will, and I've mostly stopped expecting one. I still can't fall asleep without that fan running. In any apartment, in any city, no matter how far from vermin I move. I've learned to live inside that particular irony without examining it too closely. That the same trained, sensitive hearing that once let me catch a rhythm nobody else would have noticed is now something I actively work every single night to drown out. Because some knowledge, once you have it, doesn't get quieter just because you've moved somewhere new. If you live alone in an old house and you hear something in the ceiling tonight that sounds just a little too even, too paced, too deliberate to be settling wood, I'm not going to tell you it's nothing. I spent 20 nights telling myself that, and I was wrong every single one of them. I'd just make sure, before you fall back asleep, that you're actually alone. If you think that story was unsettling, don't go anywhere. The next one starts with something so ordinary that almost anyone would ignore it until it was far too late. Every single night, at exactly 9 p.m., I heard a branch snap in the woods behind my house. Not 8:58, not 9:03. 9 o'clock, on the dot, like clockwork. For weeks before I understood that clockwork was exactly the problem. I live alone in a small house at the edge of a rural stretch outside Portland, close enough to real woods that deer wander into my yard most mornings, and the power occasionally flickers when a storm rolls through the tree line. I moved out here about a year ago, mostly for the quiet, mostly because after years of city noise, I wanted somewhere I could actually hear myself think. For most of that year, it delivered exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet evenings, owls some nights, the occasional coyote yipping somewhere far off. The first time I heard the branch snap, I didn't think anything of it at all. I was in my kitchen doing dishes, half paying attention to a podcast, and the sound cut through clearly enough that I glanced toward the back window out of pure reflex, the way you do with any sudden noise. Nothing there but the dark tree line and my own dim reflection in the glass. I figured a deer had wandered close to the fence, maybe a raccoon rustling through the underbrush. Woods make woods noises. It didn't register as anything worth remembering. It was the second night, hearing that same distinct snap at almost the same time, that I first noted the timing consciously, not with any alarm yet, just a small, idle observation, the kind you'd make about a neighbor's dog, barking at the same hour every evening. Coincidence, I told myself. Animals develop patterns. Deer especially tend to move on predictable schedules, grazing at dusk, settling as it gets fully dark. By the end of that first week, though, the precision had become impossible to write off as pure coincidence. Every night, right at 9, that same sharp crack of a branch breaking, coming from roughly the same direction each time. Somewhere just past my back fence line, where the tree cover got thick enough that I couldn't see more than a few feet in without a flashlight. I started standing at that back window most evenings, around 8:55, waiting for it, telling myself I was just curious about which animal had such an oddly consistent internal clock. For a while, I actually found it sort of charming. This idea that some deer, or whatever it was, had developed such a rigid little routine that I could set a clock by it. I mentioned it to my sister on a phone call, half laughing, calling it my woodland neighbor. She laughed along with me, said something about how animals really do get into habits like that, especially around consistent food sources or established trails. It stayed that way for almost 3 weeks. Same sound, same time, nothing else attached to it. I stopped standing at the window every night eventually, since nothing ever followed the sound besides silence afterward. It became background noise, essentially, something my brain filed away as ordinary rather than something worth investigating. Then, one evening in early October, I decided, mostly out of idle curiosity, to actually try to see what was making the sound. I'd picked up a cheap trail camera a while back for an entirely unrelated reason, thinking about photographing the deer that occasionally came through. And it occurred to me, standing in my kitchen around 8:40 that night, that I still had it sitting unused in a closet. I dug it out, mounted it hastily on a post near the back fence, angled toward the tree line, and went to bed without much expectation of catching anything meaningful. The next morning, scrolling through the captured images over coffee, I found nothing for most of the evening. Dark, empty frames, the infrared triggering a few times, for what looked like nothing more than wind-moving branches. Then, right around 9:11 p.m., the timestamp confirmed it precisely. One frame showed something that made my coffee mug freeze halfway to my mouth. A figure, standing just behind my fence line, mostly obscured by brush, but unmistakably a person. Tall, facing directly toward my house. I sat with that image for a long time, scrolling back and forth between it and the surrounding empty frames, trying to convince myself it was some trick of shadow and infrared distortion, a branch or a stump catching the light at an unfortunate angle that merely resembled a human shape. It's the kind of thing you desperately want to be able to explain away when you live alone, a mile from your nearest neighbor. But the more I looked at it, the less convinced I became that it was anything but exactly what it looked like. I checked the following frames carefully, watching the timestamps tick forward minute by minute. The figure hadn't moved. Not an inch, as far as I could tell comparing each frame side by side. Same posture, same position, relative to the fence post. Same unbroken stillness, stretching across nearly 30 full minutes before the camera's motion-triggered capture finally stopped recording anything at all, presumably once he'd left the frame, though there was no image showing him actually walking away. 30 minutes, standing motionless in the dark, facing my house, at the exact hour that branch had been snapping for weeks. I told myself, sitting there with my coffee gone cold, that there had to be a mundane explanation. A hunter, maybe, scouting the area before deer season, standing still out of some hunting instinct about staying quiet and unmoving. Or a neighbor from further down the road, cutting through the woods on some habitual evening walk, pausing to check his phone or catch his breath at a spot that happened to face my property. Rural areas have their share of people who move through land that technically isn't theirs, and not all of it means anything sinister. I wanted very badly to believe one of those explanations. For a few days, I actually managed to, mostly by simply not checking the camera footage each morning, telling myself I didn't need to keep dwelling on it. Then, the following week, an unrelated errand took me into town, and I ran into someone I vaguely knew from a hardware store trip months earlier, a retired guy named Pete, who lived a couple properties over and knew, as far as I could tell, most of the comings and goings on that stretch of road. I mentioned, as casually as I could manage, that I thought I'd seen someone standing near my back fence some evenings, wondering if maybe he knew of any hunters or hikers who regularly cut through that section of woods. He got a strange look on his face, something careful and hesitant, and said, slowly, that he'd never known anyone to use that particular stretch for hunting or hiking, that the terrain back there was thick, unpleasant scrub, nothing worth walking through on purpose unless you had a specific reason to be exactly there. That answer sat with me uncomfortably for the rest of that day. And it was that same evening, right around 8:55, that I found myself standing at my back window again, waiting, my heart already beating harder than the situation should have warranted, for something I still hadn't fully admitted to myself was actually frightening. For nearly a week after that conversation with Pete, nothing happened at all. No branch snapping, no figure showing up on the trail camera footage, nothing but ordinary quiet nights, the way things used to be before any of this started. I should have felt relieved. Instead, that stretch of silence unsettled me more than the actual sound ever had. I kept catching myself standing at that window anyway, out of some compulsive habit now, waiting for something that wasn't coming, and somehow the absence of it felt like its own kind of warning, like something had simply paused rather than stopped. I nearly convinced myself, by the end of that week, that whatever it had been, it was over. Some passing curiosity from a stranger who'd lost interest, or genuinely, just an unusual coincidence of wildlife and shifting light that I'd built into something far larger in my own head. I told my sister as much on our next call, framing the whole thing as a strange little story that had resolved itself. Nothing more. Then, on a Tuesday evening, right at 9, the branch snapped again. I was at that window within seconds, adrenaline already spiking hard, scanning the dark tree line for any shape at all. Nothing visible to the naked eye, same as every time before. But this time, I didn't just stand there and wait it out. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the live feed from the trail camera, and watched the screen with my heart hammering loud enough that I could feel it in my ears. The image resolved slowly in the poor light, infrared picking up heat signatures more than clear detail. But there was no mistaking the shape settling into frame near the fence post. Same spot as before, same unnervingly still posture. I stood at that window, watching my own phone screen, watching him, watching my house, for what felt like an eternity, but was, according to the timestamp later, almost the exact same 30 minutes as the first time. He never moved. He never approached the fence, never tried to climb it, never did anything beyond simply standing there, facing my home in the dark, patient in a way that felt entirely wrong for an innocent explanation. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, exhausted and rattled, I called the local sheriff's office, feeling faintly ridiculous, even dialing the number. How do you explain, without sounding unhinged, that someone stands at your fence line every so often and simply watches your house without ever doing anything else? But the deputy who eventually called me back took it more seriously than I expected, especially once I described the pattern, the exact timing, the stillness of it. He said they'd increase patrols on that stretch of road for a while and asked me to keep documenting anything I saw. For the following several nights, nothing happened. No sound, no figure in the trail cam footage. Nothing at all disturbing that stretch of quiet dark behind my house. I wanted to feel reassured. Instead, I found myself almost anticipating it, my body tensing every evening as 9 o'clock approached, regardless of whether anything actually occurred. A learned dread that didn't seem to care whether there was a real trigger behind it or not. It was on the fourth quiet night, lying in bed around 11 p.m., that I heard something entirely different from the usual pattern. Not a branch snapping outside, but a much closer sound. The specific creak of my back porch step. The one that's always given a distinctive groan whenever any weight settles on it. I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear anything further. My whole body gone rigid and cold. Nothing else followed. No footsteps, no further creaking, no sound of anyone trying the door. Just that single, isolated groan of old wood, and then absolute, total silence, stretching out for the rest of the night. A silence that felt heavier and more deliberate than any silence had before. I didn't get up to check. I lay there instead, staring at my bedroom ceiling, telling myself it was probably just the temperature dropping, wood contracting the way old porches do on cool nights. The same kind of explanation I'd leaned on so many times before, except this time, it didn't quite land the way it used to. Something about that particular stillness afterward made my skin crawl in a way the fence line sightings, distant as they were, somehow hadn't managed to. The following morning, I finally checked the trail camera footage from that night more carefully than I had any previous morning, scrolling frame by frame around the timestamp that matched when I'd heard the porch step creak. There was nothing at the fence line at all that night, no figure standing among the trees. No motion triggering the camera's infrared sensor in that usual spot, which meant, I realized slowly, with a cold, sinking feeling settling into my chest, that whatever had made that porch step groan hadn't come from the woods at all. It had come from somewhere closer, somewhere the camera, angled only toward the back fence, had never actually been watching. I called the sheriff's office again that same day, more insistent this time, and a deputy came out personally to walk the property with me. We found something near the base of the porch steps that made my stomach turn the moment he pointed it out. A small folding camp chair, tucked discreetly behind a cluster of overgrown shrubs at the corner of my house, angled in such a way that whoever sat in it would have a clear, unobstructed view straight into my kitchen window. The deputy crouched down beside it, examining the ground nearby, and found something else, half buried in the dirt beside the chair leg. A small spiral notebook, weathered from exposure, but still mostly legible. He flipped through a few pages, his expression shifting into something grim and careful, before showing it to me. It was filled with handwritten notes, dates, times, brief clinical observations about my daily routine, when I left for work, when I got home, when my kitchen light usually turned on, when it usually turned off. Pages and pages of it, stretching back further than I wanted to think about, longer than the few weeks I'd actually been aware anything was wrong at all. The deputy stayed a long time after that, walking the perimeter of my property with me while backup arrived, everyone moving with a heightened, careful seriousness that hadn't been there during our first conversation. They photographed the chair, bagged the notebook as evidence, and widened their search along the tree line and the stretch of woods behind my fence, looking for anything else that might connect to what we'd found. They didn't catch him that day. Whoever had been sitting in that chair, recording my routines with that careful, patient handwriting, was gone. By the time anyone thought to look for him directly, no trace beyond the chair and the notebook, no clear trail through the brush that led anywhere conclusive. The deputy told me, with a kind of grim honesty I appreciated, that even as it terrified me further, that they'd keep patrolling more frequently, that I should consider additional lighting, maybe a proper security system, rather than just a single trail camera pointed in one direction. I didn't sleep in that house again without every light in it turned on for the rest of that week. I kept replaying the entries in that notebook in my mind, the sheer mundane detail of it. Not threats, not anything overtly violent, just quiet, meticulous documentation of when I came and went, when my kitchen light clicked on each evening. Small facts about my life, recorded with an unsettling, patient thoroughness that felt somehow worse than something more obviously aggressive would have. The branch, snapping at 9, I realized eventually, hadn't been an accident of timing at all. It had been deliberate, a way of drawing my attention toward the woods, toward that empty, distant tree line, while he settled into his hidden vantage point near the house itself, close enough to actually watch me through my own kitchen window without me ever thinking to look there. The investigation dragged on for weeks after that, without ever producing a name, a face, anyone. The sheriff's department could actually charge with anything. They found a few more small signs during their sweeps of the surrounding woods. A worn path through the brush that clearly saw regular foot traffic. Another cache of supplies tucked beneath a fallen log, a little further out, suggesting whoever this was had been settling into that patch of land for a genuinely long stretch of time before I'd ever noticed the first snapped branch. But no one was ever caught standing there again, no matter how many extra patrols came through, no matter how many nights I sat awake, watching my own camera feed with the lights blazing around me. I moved out of that house within 2 months, breaking my lease early and eating the cost without much hesitation. I couldn't make myself stay in a place where I now understood every ordinary evening routine of mine had been quietly recorded by someone I'd never even glimpsed clearly, sitting patiently in a chair a few feet from my own kitchen window. There are explanations offered, the kind meant to bring some kind of resolution, even when the actual facts refuse to cooperate. One deputy suggested it might have been a drifter, someone living rough in the surrounding woods who'd simply fixated on the nearest occupied house out of some combination of loneliness and opportunity, more interested in watching a life he felt disconnected from than in ever actually intruding on it directly. Another offered a colder theory, one that stayed with me longer than I'd like, that the branch snapping itself, so precisely timed, suggested careful planning, rather than any kind of drifting opportunism. Someone deliberate enough that leaving without a trace, again and again, wasn't luck so much as practiced skill. I live in town now, in an apartment with neighbors close enough on either side that I can hear their television through the walls. Some nights, a sound that used to bother me, and now, if I'm honest, I find strangely comforting. I still check my windows compulsively before dark, still feel my whole body tense a little every evening as 9 o'clock approaches, even now, even here, with woods nowhere close enough to explain a branch snapping anywhere nearby at all. Every story in this collection begins with one small detail that doesn't seem important at first. The next one starts exactly the same way and ends somewhere no one expects.
I'm Mia, 27. I work in marketing. And about 5 months ago, I moved into a third-floor apartment in one of those older converted buildings up on Capitol Hill in Seattle. I liked the privacy of it. Honestly, I don't have people over much. And after a string of noisy roommate situations in my early 20s, having a place entirely to myself felt like a genuine upgrade. It started so small, I didn't even register it as a start at the time. I came home from one evening around 6:30, went into the bathroom to grab something, and found the mirror fogged with condensation. The whole room warm and humid in that specific way it gets right after someone's taken a hot shower. I stood there for a second, a little thrown, before deciding I'd probably just left the exhaust fan off that morning and the moisture had lingered all day. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and I didn't think about it again. A few days later, I noticed my towel on the hook was slightly damp when I got home, though I distinctly remembered hanging it up dry after my own shower that morning. I chalked it up to Seattle humidity. The whole city runs damp for most of the year, and towels here never seem to fully dry out on schedule. Made sense enough. Then there was the shampoo. A bottle I'd bought only 2 weeks earlier was nearly empty, despite how little I typically used per wash. I mentioned it to my best friend over the phone, half joking, and she laughed it off, said I probably used more than I thought. Or maybe the cap was faulty and leaking somewhere I hadn't noticed. That felt plausible too. People are notoriously bad at accurately tracking their own small daily habits. I told myself that was probably exactly what was happening here. After those 3 little moments, everything went quiet for almost a week. No fog, no unexplained dampness, nothing out of place. I nearly forgot the whole vague unease had ever bothered me at all. It was during my regular bathroom cleaning, a few weeks in, that things stopped feeling explainable in any comfortable way. I was clearing out the drain catcher, something I do every couple of weeks out of habit, and found a small clump of hair tangled in the mesh. Short, dark brown, slightly wavy. Nothing like my own hair at all, which is long, straight, and dyed a much lighter color. I stood there, holding that little clump of hair for what felt like a long time. And that was the first moment the unease actually turned into something colder. Something I couldn't talk myself out of the way I had with the fog or the towel. It wasn't ambiguous anymore. It was just wrong, in a way that had a physical shape to it, sitting right there in my palm. Once I started actually looking, more small things surfaced that I'd apparently been overlooking. The spare, still sealed toothbrush I kept in the cabinet had been shifted slightly. Its box lid sitting just a little askew from how I remembered leaving it. There was a faint soap residue along the tub wall at a height that didn't match how I normally showered, standing rather than using the tub at all. And the bath mat kept showing a faint, damp footprint, each evening larger than my own foot, that would slowly dry out over the course of the day, before I got home to see it fresh again. Rattled, I pulled up the footage from the Wi-Fi camera I already had mounted by my front door, installed originally out of general safety concerns. Nothing to do with any of this. I scrolled through an entire week's worth of footage. Nothing. No unfamiliar face, no unexplained door openings while I was out. Nothing suspicious at all beyond my own comings and goings. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it deepened the fear into something worse. If no one was coming or going through my front door, then whoever, or whatever, was sharing my bathroom with me had some other way in and out entirely. One I had absolutely no way of monitoring. I told 2 close friends about all of it over coffee one evening, laying it out as calmly as I could manage. One of them looked genuinely concerned. The other, more bluntly, suggested I'd probably just been doing all of this myself without remembering. That stress does strange things to memory, that everyone's more forgetful about their own daily habits than they'd like to admit. I remember that comment settling into me uncomfortably, planting a seed of doubt about my own mind that felt almost worse than the original fear. That seed of doubt stayed with me for days afterward. This quiet, gnawing uncertainty about whether I could actually trust my own memory of my own routines. I started second-guessing small things. I would have sworn on anything a week earlier had I really hung that towel dry. Or just assumed I had, because that's what I usually did. It's a particular kind of unsettling. Having a friend you trust suggest, gently, that the problem might be inside your own head rather than anywhere else. I decided I needed proof, one way or another, either to confirm something was actually happening, or to finally put my own mind at ease if it really was just stress and forgetfulness. I bought a small camera, quietly, telling no one this time, not even my closest friend. Embarrassed at the idea of being thought paranoid twice in 1 month, I set it up in the living room, angled to cover the hallway leading to the bathroom, and told myself I'd know the truth within a week either way. The first 3 nights showed nothing, just me, moving through my own apartment at ordinary hours, nothing else in frame at all. I started to relax during that stretch, actually feeling a little foolish about the whole thing, telling myself my friend had probably been right that Seattle humidity, an overtired mind, and a bit of anxious pattern-seeking had built an entire ghost story out of nothing more than ordinary domestic clutter. On the 4th night, I slept straight through whatever the camera caught, and only found it the next morning scrolling through the overnight clips with my coffee cooling beside me. At 3:58 a.m., the bathroom door eased open, and a man stepped out middle-aged, wearing a worn t-shirt and shorts, moving with a completely unhurried, unbothered calm, like he was simply getting up in his own home rather than stepping out of a stranger's bathroom in the dead of night. He walked straight to my living room couch, sat down, and turned on the TV. He stayed there for almost 20 minutes. What unsettled me most, watching that footage over and over with my hands not quite steady, wasn't just that he was there, it was how completely at ease he seemed the entire time. He scratched his head at one point, shifted position on the couch the way anyone does trying to get comfortable, flipped between a couple of channels like he had genuine preferences about what he wanted to watch. There was no glancing over his shoulder, no rushed, furtive energy of someone who knew they weren't supposed to be there. He sat in my living room, on my couch, in the dead of night, with the calm, settled posture of a man in his own home. That absolute calm frightened me more than anything overtly threatening could have. It told me this wasn't some one-time break-in, some opportunistic stranger who'd stumbled onto an unlocked door. This was routine. This was comfortable, practiced, repeated enough times that he no longer felt any need to hurry. At exactly 4:19, according to the timestamp, he turned off the TV, stood, walked back to the bathroom, and closed the door gently behind him. The camera never caught him leaving the bathroom after that. No door reopening, no further sound picked up on the audio track. Nothing at all. Following that moment, like he'd simply dissolved back into wherever he'd come from in the first place. I watched that clip more than a dozen times, my hands shaking harder each time, before I finally made myself stop, grab a bag, and leave the apartment that same morning. I went straight to a friend's place and called the police from her kitchen table, my voice barely holding steady enough to give them the address. Officers met me back at the building that afternoon, and I walked them through the footage first, watching their expressions shift from polite, procedural attentiveness into something more focused as the video played. They searched the bathroom, thoroughly checked behind the tub, examined the walls, found nothing obviously out of place at first glance. It was only when one of the officers rapped his knuckles against the drop ceiling above the tub, the kind of false ceiling common in older converted buildings like mine, meant to hide plumbing runs, that something changed. The sound came back hollow, distinctly different from the solid thud it gave everywhere else in the apartment. They pried a panel loose, and beneath it was a narrow gap, just wide enough for a person to lie in sideways, running off into a wider utility space that threaded along the building's plumbing lines. A space that, as one officer explained grimly, likely connected to similar gaps above multiple units throughout the building, allowing movement between apartments without ever using the shared hallways at all. Inside that cramped space, they found a thin blanket, folded with a kind of careful neatness that made my skin crawl. A few packets of dry food, a water bottle, and then the detail that made my knees genuinely buckle. An officer having to steady me by the arm, dozens of printed photographs, me, sleeping, taken from multiple angles across what looked like several weeks. Some of them, based on the angle, had clearly been taken through the small vent grate positioned directly above my own bed. I sat in the back of a patrol car for a long while after that, unable to fully process what I'd just seen. My whole body cold in a way that had nothing to do with the actual temperature outside. It took investigators several more days to build out the full picture, and what they eventually pieced together was somehow both stranger and more mundane than anything I'd imagined lying awake those first few nights. The man had lived in a different unit in that same building years earlier, before I'd ever moved, and had been evicted after falling behind on rent. What no one had realized was that he'd never actually left the building at all. He'd simply retreated into the network of gaps and utility spaces running between the floors and walls, living there for what investigators estimated could have been years, moving between different units, depending, as one detective put it with a kind of grim clinical detachment on convenience. He'd apparently settled on my apartment, at least for that stretch, because I lived alone and rarely had guests, which made it easier for him to move around undetected. What unsettled me almost as much as the discovery itself was what they didn't find. No evidence he'd ever gone through my belongings for anything valuable. No signs of theft beyond the shampoo, the shower water, Small, consumable things, rather than anything that would show up as a real loss. And, according to the initial forensic assessment, no indication he'd ever touched me while I slept. The only things he'd genuinely taken, as far as anyone could determine, were small resources and a quiet, ongoing presence in my most private spaces, which somehow made the whole situation harder to categorize than a straightforward break-in. And harder still to stop thinking about, precisely because there was no clean, satisfying motive to attach to any of it. I moved out within the week, choosing this time to prioritize one thing above everything else: a ground floor unit in a newly constructed building. No drop ceilings, no hidden utility gaps threading between apartments. Nothing at all that could conceal a person the way that old building had. I asked the leasing office for full architectural plans before I'd even sign anything, a request that clearly struck them as unusual, though I didn't care in the slightest how strange it made me look. It's a habit I've kept ever since, one I don't imagine I'll ever fully let go of for a long time afterward. I couldn't shower without checking the vent above my head first, without running my hand along the ceiling seams just to be sure nothing sat hollow behind them. Even now, in a place I know objectively is different, safer. Physically incapable of hiding what that old apartment had hidden, I still find myself doing it some nights, a quiet, almost automatic ritual before I let myself relax enough to actually get undressed. There are explanations the police offered, the kind meant to bring some sense of closure, even when the full picture stays murky. A detective suggested the man's situation likely stemmed from some combination of housing instability and a deteriorating mental state, that living undetected inside a building's infrastructure for that long pointed towards someone who'd slipped through every safety net that might otherwise have caught him, and who'd built an entire secret routine around the buildings and people closest at hand, rather than seeking out anyone from further away. Another officer, more bluntly, admitted they still weren't entirely sure how long he'd actually been doing this, or across how many years. He might have moved through before anyone noticed. I don't know how many other people in that building, or others like it, might have unknowingly shared their homes the way I did without ever finding out. That thought alone has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those weeks, not just what happened to me, but the unsettling math of how many small, explainable inconveniences someone else might be quietly rationalizing away right now. The same way I once rationalized fog on a mirror and a slightly damp towel a few months after I moved. An old friend from a previous job mentioned, completely unaware of anything that had happened to me, that she'd just signed a lease in that same building, a different unit, a different floor. Nothing connecting it to my old apartment except the address itself. I never told her why that made my stomach drop the way it did. I just wished her well on the move and left it there, telling myself the odds of anything similar happening again were vanishingly small, that whatever had been living in those walls had surely been found, removed, dealt with by now. A few weeks after she moved in, she texted me something offhand, nothing she thought twice about. Just idle small talk between old coworkers catching up. Random, but my bathroom's been weirdly steamy lately, even when I haven't showered, lol. Old building, I guess. I stared at that message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button, not entirely sure what I was supposed to say back, or whether saying anything at all would even help her believe me if I tried.
That wasn't the only story that stayed with me. The next one is different, but somehow even harder to explain.
My parents left for Puerto Vallarta on a Friday morning in July, and I had the house to myself for 8 days. I was 19, back from my first year at community college, working part-time at a hardware store, and genuinely excited about a week of empty house freedom, sleeping late, eating cereal for dinner, not answering to anyone. We live in a pretty quiet subdivision outside Dayton, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where everyone's mailbox looks the same and nothing ever happens. I want to establish that up front, because nothing ever happens here is going to sound almost funny by the time I'm done. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted. Boring, in the good way. I mowed the lawn because my dad asked me to. Texted my parents a couple of "having a great time, wish you were here, LOL JK" jokes, and mostly just existed in the quiet. Sunday afternoon, around 2, someone rang the doorbell. I remember the exact time because our doorbell camera timestamps everything. And I checked it later, more than once, for reasons that'll make sense soon. 2:12 p.m. I opened the door, and there was a man standing on the porch in a full uniform light gray polo shirt with our utility company's logo stitched over the chest, a laminated ID badge clipped to his waistband, a clipboard, the whole deal. Maybe mid-40s. Unremarkable in every way you'd want a stranger to be unremarkable. He had that easy, slightly bored professionalism that utility workers have. Like he'd knocked on 400 doors that week already. "Afternoon," he said. "Sorry to bother you, we're doing meter checks in this area. Had a couple reports of irregular readings on the block. Won't take more than a few minutes. I want to be honest about something here. Because it matters, I didn't think twice." He had the uniform, the badge, the clipboard, the whole visual language of "this is fine, this is normal." My dad's always been the type to make me double-check strangers. But this guy didn't feel like a stranger in the way that sets off alarms. He felt like a category of person, a meter guy. "You don't interrogate the mail carrier either." I said sure. Told him the meter was around back. And he said he actually needed to check something inside first. Sometimes the panel readings don't match what's outside. Gotta compare both. Which, again, sounded like something a person who knew about electricity would say. I let him in. "That's detail number 1 I want you to hold on to. Not suspicious yet, just held on to." I walked straight to our breaker panel in the hallway closet like he already knew where it was, which I remember registering as slightly odd and then immediately unregistering. Because obviously utility workers know where breaker panels usually are in houses like ours. They're all built the same. Right cookie-cutter subdivision, cookie-cutter electrical layout. That's not evidence of anything. I told myself that then. And I'm telling you that now. Because that's exactly the kind of thing you talk yourself out of when you're 19 and alone and want the day to keep being boring. He opened the panel, clicked a little device against a few of the breakers, jotted something on his clipboard. Ordinary, fine. Then he started asking questions. "You home alone?" he asked, not even looking up from his clipboard, like it was just filler conversation. The kind of thing you say to fill silence while you work. "Just for the week," I said. "My parents are out of town." "Nice," he said. "Just you in the house, huh?" He clicked the little meter device against another breaker. "You got any pets?" Sometimes animals mess with the wiring in the crawl space, chew through insulation. "No pets," I said. "Good, makes this easier." He said it so casually, I didn't even clock it as a strange thing to say, "makes this easier," until much later. Lying in bed that night, turning the whole visit over in my head, the way you do with small talk you can't quite place. He kept going, still writing things down between questions, still sounding bored in that specific customer service way that made everything feel routine. He asked what time I usually left for work. He asked if the house had a security system. I said no. We'd talked about it, but never got one, and I remember him nodding like that was useful information rather than small talk. He asked if my parents' trip was a week thing or longer. And when I said they'd be back the following Saturday, he made a little note. At the time, none of this felt like an interrogation. It felt like a chatty guy doing a boring job, filling dead air the way people do. I answered everything without hesitation, because why wouldn't I? He was standing in my hallway in a uniform with a badge, doing exactly the kind of low-stakes utility task that doesn't usually come with a hidden agenda. The whole visit took almost 40 minutes. That's the second detail I want you to hold on to. 40 minutes for a meter check that should have taken 5. He kept finding reasons to linger, checking a few more outlets. Just to be thorough, asking to see the fuse box in the garage too, commenting on how old the wiring in a house like ours tended to be. Every individual minute felt justified. It was only in total, looking back, that the number felt wrong when he finally left. He shook my hand a little too firm, a little too long, though I told myself that was just a confident handshake guy thing and said, "Everything looks fine here. Might see a little flickering the next day or two while the grid recalibrates on our end. That's normal. Nothing to worry about." I thanked him. I actually thanked him. I remember closing the door and thinking, well, that was thorough. And going back to my cereal for dinner Sunday like nothing had happened. I didn't think about him again until the lights started doing exactly what he said they would. Monday evening. The kitchen light flickered while I was making dinner. Just once. A quick stutter. On, off, on. The kind of thing that happens in every house eventually and means nothing. I remember actually feeling relieved when I saw it see. I thought. He called it. Grid recalibration. Exactly like he said. It made the whole visit feel more legitimate in hindsight, not less. A guy who accurately predicts a minor electrical hiccup is a guy who knew what he was talking about. Tuesday. It happened twice the hallway light this time. Then, an hour later, the lamp in the living room, both quick flickers, both easy to dismiss individually. I texted my mom a picture of the breaker panel with a joking caption. Something like, "The electricity guy came by. Hope this house doesn't burn down while you're gone, LO." And she texted back a laughing emoji and told me to just keep an eye on it. Normal mom response. Nothing alarming in either direction. I want to be honest that at this point, I wasn't scared. Mildly annoyed. Maybe. In the way you get annoyed at minor house problems. But not scared. This is the part of the story where, if I were watching this happen to someone else, I'd probably be yelling at the screen. But lived from the inside, one flicker a day doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like a house doing house things. Wednesday night is when the pattern actually became impossible to explain away. I was in my room around 11, half asleep with my laptop open, when every light in the house went out at once, not a flicker, full dark. The kind of dark you don't get in a suburban house at night, because there's always some LED glowing somewhere. A router light, a microwave clock, a phone charger. All of it. Gone. Simultaneously. I sat there in the dark for a second doing the thing you do, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Waiting for the hum of the refrigerator to cut back in. Waiting for some obvious explanation to present itself. It didn't. I grabbed my phone. Thumbs slick with sweat I didn't notice building until right then, and pulled up the flashlight, and made my way to the kitchen window to see if the whole street was out. It wasn't. I could see our neighbor's porch light across the street, glowing steady and normal, along with the street lamp at the end of the block, just our house, just us. I stood at that window for what felt like a long time, watching that one lit porch light like it was a life raft, telling myself a dozen different reasonable things, a tripped breaker, bad wiring the electrician guy had mentioned. Maybe something actually related to whatever he'd fixed on Sunday going sideways. I almost went to check the breaker panel myself. I got as far as the hallway closet. Hand on the door. Before some instinct I still can't fully explain told me not to open it in the dark, alone, at 11 at night. And I don't know exactly what I thought was going to be different about that closet versus any other part of my own house. But I backed away from it instead. I checked my phone. 11:07 p.m. The power came back on at exactly 11:17. 10 minutes. Not a blown fuse, not a random grid issue. 10 clean. Precise minutes. On to off to on. Like someone had set a timer. I stood in my newly lit kitchen with my heart going too fast, laughing a little at myself. Actually laughing. Because it felt so stupid to be this shaken by a power blip. Ohio summers are hard on old grids. Storms mess with transformers, sometimes even without visible storms nearby. I told myself all of that. I went to bed telling myself all of that. Nothing happened Thursday. Not one flicker. The house was completely, perfectly normal for a full 24 hours. And I remember that quiet stretch feeling almost stranger than the outage had, like the house was holding its breath along with me, waiting to see if I'd relaxed enough to stop paying attention by Friday. I'd mostly talked myself back into normal. I went to my hardware store shift that morning, came home, ordered pizza, watched some show I don't even remember now, and didn't think about breaker panels or timed outages or utility guys with a little too much curiosity about my schedule. One quiet day will do that to you. It resets something. I've thought about that a lot, since how the human brain treats "nothing happened yesterday" as evidence that nothing will happen today. Even though that's not how anything actually works. Around 9 that night, the doorbell camera notification popped up on my phone. I almost ignored it. By that point in the week, I'd gotten a dozen notifications for nothing. A moth on the lens, a neighbor's cat crossing the yard, but something made me open it. It was him. Same gray polo, same badge clipped at his waist. Standing on our porch in the porch light I'd watched so intently 3 nights before. Except this time he wasn't reaching for the doorbell. I wasn't holding a clipboard. He was just standing there, hands loose at his sides, facing the door dead on. Close enough that the camera's fisheye lens caught his whole upper body in frame. I watched the live feed with my thumb hovering over the screen. Not breathing right, waiting for him to knock, to ring, to do literally anything that would make this feel like a normal visit. I didn't. He stood there for 11 seconds, I know, because I counted it obsessively afterward, scrubbing back and forth on the recorded clip until the number was burned into me. And then he turned, unhurried, and walked back down the driveway and out of frame, toward the street. The same easy, unremarkable gait he'd had walking into my house on Sunday. I sat frozen on my bed with the phone in my hand for a solid 2 minutes before I made myself get up and check every door and window in the house. All of them locked, all of them fine, and I told myself out loud. Actually, alone in my room. Which tells you something about where my head was, that maybe he was on some kind of follow-up route, checking exterior units, and just decided this house didn't need a knock. Maybe he saw a light on and figured no one needed help. Help, maybe. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the hallway light on, which felt both comforting and, in hindsight, a little absurd, given that the lights were the thing I didn't trust anymore. Saturday morning, my parents' flight was due in that evening. One more night alone, I decided that I needed the visit to have a reasonable explanation. The kind you can only get by calling and asking. So I looked up our utility company's customer service number and called. I explained it as calmly as I could to the woman on the line. A technician had come out Sunday for a meter check. Said there'd been reports of irregular readings on our block. Wanted to confirm the visit was logged and ask about the flickering afterward. There was a pause, keys clicking. Then she asked me to repeat the date and address, and I did. And there was another pause, longer this time. Ma'am, sorry. Sir, I'm not showing any service call to that address. Not this week, not this month. We haven't had any reports of irregular readings on that street at all. I asked her to check again. I gave her our account number, our full address spelled out slowly, the date, everything. She put me on hold for almost 5 minutes, 5 of the longest minutes I've ever sat through, standing in my kitchen in the same spot where the lights had gone out 6 days earlier and when she came back. Her voice had that careful, practiced calm that customer service reps use when they can tell something's actually wrong on your end and don't want to say so directly. I've checked with dispatch and with the field team supervisor, she said. We don't have any technician assigned to your route this week. No work orders, no meter check requests. Nothing logged for your address at all in the last 30 days. I remember standing there with the phone against my ear, my other hand flat on the counter like I needed something solid to touch, running back through Sunday afternoon the uniform, the badge with the company logo, the clipboard, the specific, correct brand of easy professional confidence that I had never once thought to question. I asked her, my voice not quite steady, if it was possible a technician just hadn't logged the visit yet. Some paperwork delay. It's possible for logging to be a day or two behind, she said, but not a week. And never for meter checks, those get flagged same day because they involve entering a customer's breaker panel. That's a liability thing on our end. If someone came into your home claiming to be one of our technicians, I need you to know that we take that seriously. Do you want me to connect you to loss prevention? Or would you rather contact local police directly? I don't remember exactly what I said back to her. I remember thanking her in a voice that didn't sound like mine, and hanging up, and standing very still in my kitchen for a long time, running the whole week backward like film through a projector, trying to find the moment where I should have known. The uniform had been real. The badge had looked real laminated. A photo. A logo I recognized because I'd seen it on our own bills 100 times. The clipboard had real-looking paperwork on it, or at least I remembered lines and boxes that looked official, though I couldn't now recall if I'd actually read a single word on it or just seen the shape of officialdom and let that be enough. That's the part that still gets me, even now. I never verified anything. I saw the visual grammar of trustworthiness, the shirt, the badge, the clipboard, the bored professional tone. And I built the rest of the story myself. Filled in utility company employee, the way you fill in a shape you're shown only half of. He never even had to lie especially well. I did most of the work for him, the way I think most people would. I called the police next, gave them everything, the time-stamped doorbell footage from Sunday and from Friday night, the description, the outage times, the questions he'd asked about whether I was home alone and for how long. An officer came out that evening, took a report, walked the perimeter of the house with a flashlight, checked the breaker panel himself, and found nothing tampered with in any way he could identify, no unusual wiring, no device attached, nothing a home inspector wouldn't call ordinary. Might have been someone posing as a technician to case the house. He told me, not unkindly, standing in my driveway as the sky went dark. Happens more than people think. Uniforms are easy to buy online if he comes back. Don't open the door, call us immediately. I asked him about the power outage. The precise 10 minutes. The way it had started and stopped almost to the second. He didn't have an answer for that. He said something about it possibly being coincidental. An unrelated grid issue that happened to overlap with an unrelated stalking incident. Two separate bad things, stacking on the same week by chance. I remember nodding at that explanation, the way you nod at something you don't believe, but don't have anything better to offer instead. My parents were due home in a few hours. I sat on the living room couch with every light in the house on, phone in my lap, doorbell camera app open, and waited. My parents got home around 10 that night, and I told them everything before they'd even finished bringing their bags in from the car. The fake technician, the questions, the outages, the 10 minutes, the doorbell footage, the phone call to the utility company confirming none of it had been real. I watched my dad's face go through the same sequence mine had, disbelief sliding into something more like quiet alarm. And I think having to say it all out loud, watching someone else's face change while I did, made it feel real to me in a way it hadn't quite managed to feel, while I was alone in the house living it. We didn't sleep much that first night back. My dad walked the house twice, checked every window latch, and in the morning, he called a security company and had a full system installed within the weak cameras on all 4 sides. Motion sensors, the works. My parents don't talk about that trip to Puerto Vallarta anymore, without also talking about what happened while they were gone. Like the two things got welded together into one memory, for a while. Nothing else happened. No more flickering, no more outages, no more figures standing on the porch at night. The camera footage from Sunday and Friday got handed over to the police, and an actual investigation opened. Someone impersonating a utility worker to gain entry to homes is a real crime, not just an unsettling story. And apparently, there had been a couple of vague, unconfirmed reports from other towns in the region over the past year. Nothing solid enough to have made local news, just enough for an officer to tell us carefully. that we weren't necessarily the first. That should have been the quiet, unresolved ending. A guy who lied his way into a house, asked too many questions, and got scared off before doing anything more than lingering. I could have told you this story and stopped right there, and it would have already been more than enough to keep me checking my locks twice a night for months afterward. But there's one more piece, and it's the reason I still think about that whole week more than almost anything else that's ever happened to me. About 3 weeks after my parents got back, we finally sat down together and went through every second of doorbell footage from that entire 8-day stretch, start to finish. At my dad's insistence, not just the 2 clips I'd already flagged, but everything. Every motion-triggered second the camera had captured, including all the false alarms I'd swiped past without really watching a bird. A delivery truck, a neighbor's dog, the mail carrier. Nothing, except one clip. Time-stamped, Tuesday, the day between his visit and the first flicker that I had never actually opened. It had triggered at 3:47 a.m., tagged as a false alarm by the system's own motion filter. Sorted low in the list, along with dozens of other nothing clips from that week. I'd have swiped right past it 100 times without a second thought if my dad hadn't insisted we open literally everything. It was 11 seconds long, same length, I'd realize much later, as the Friday night clip, 11 seconds, exactly, both times. Though I didn't consciously count that detail until I was lying in bed that night, turning everything over again. The porch was empty, no one on it, nothing moving in frame, just our dark driveway and the edge of the lawn lit by the porch light's cone. But at second 6, a voice came through the camera's built-in microphone, close enough to the doorbell speaker that it must have been said almost directly against it, low, unhurried, in a tone that matched my dad said this before I could even say it myself, and I hated that he heard it too, because it meant I hadn't imagined the voice at all. The same voice from Sunday afternoon, the same easy, bored cadence he'd used asking whether I was home alone. 3 words, said quietly to an empty porch, to a doorbell camera he had every reason to believe was recording him at almost 4 in the 2 nights before he ever came back to stand there in person. Almost time. Ryan. My name is Ryan. I never told him that. I want to try to describe what it does to you, hearing your own name said by a stranger who has no earthly reason to know it at 4 in the morning, into a doorbell camera he apparently knew was recording. It's not like a jump scare. There's no adrenaline spike, no scream. It's slower than that, colder. It sits in your chest like something settling into place. A puzzle piece you didn't know was clicking into a picture you now can't unsee. I never gave him my name. I'm sure of that. In a way, I'm not sure of almost anything else. From that week, I went back through the conversation in my head so many times afterward that I could probably recite it verbatim. And at no point on Sunday did I introduce myself. And at no point did he ask. He asked if I was home alone. He asked about pets, about my parents' schedule, about whether we had a security system. He never once said, "And your name is," the way you would if you were just making pleasant small talk with a stranger in someone's hallway, which meant he already knew it before he ever knocked on the door. My dad and I sat with that clip open on the laptop for a long time that night, replaying it, adjusting the volume, trying to convince ourselves we'd misheard, that it was static, wind, some trick of a cheap microphone, picking up a stray frequency and our brain's pattern, matching it into words because that's what brains do with ambiguous noise. I know that's a real thing. Pareidolia for sound instead of faces. And I clung to that explanation hard for a while. But we played it for the responding officer too, later. And he heard the same 2 words we did, unprompted, before either of us told him what we thought it said. We handed that clip over along with everything else. It became part of the case file, for whatever that was worth. I never found out, and I mean this literally, not as a storytelling device, what almost time was supposed to mean, or what it was almost time. The investigation, as far as I know, never identified him. No arrest, no name, no explanation of how he'd gotten a real-looking uniform and badge. No explanation of how he knew things about our house and my schedule and my name before he ever rang our doorbell. No explanation for 10 minutes of precisely timed darkness in a house he'd supposedly only touched once. Briefly, in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. It's been almost 2 years now. My parents still live in that house, still keep every camera running, still have a folder on the family computer labeled, half joking, half not. Just in case, where that 11-second clip lives alongside all the police reports. Just sitting there, unresolved. The way most things in life apparently just get to stay unresolved if no one's ever caught. I've turned over the explanations so many times, I could probably present them like a lawyer at this point. Maybe it wasn't my actual name, he said. Maybe it was a similar sounding word, a name meant for someone else entirely. And the coincidence of it landing on mine is just that. A coincidence. The kind your brain refuses to accept as random, because random things aren't supposed to feel that targeted. Maybe he'd gotten it off mail sitting visible on the counter, or overheard a neighbor say it once, and filed it away as part of whatever casing process guys like that go through before they ever knock on a door, which would make it disturbing in an entirely different, almost more mundane way, not supernatural. Just patient, methodical surveillance that had been happening long before I ever noticed a man in a gray polo shirt on my porch. Or maybe, and this is the theory I like least, because it explains the least, it really was static and pareidolia. And two adults hearing the exact same two-word phrase in random noise, because we'd already primed each other to hear it. Wanting an answer badly enough that our brains built one out of nothing. I don't know which of those is true. Nobody ever told me, because nobody ever caught him to ask. What I do know is what's left over, 2 years later, sitting in me like sediment. I don't answer the door for uniforms anymore. Not without checking through the window first. Not without asking for ID and actually reading it instead of just recognizing its shape. I've called 3 different delivery drivers' companies directly. Mid-delivery, standing at my own front door with my phone in hand, just to confirm a name matched a route. And I've felt embarrassed every single time and done it anyway. I still, most nights, glance at the doorbell app before I go to sleep, scrolling back through the day's motion clips even when there's nothing flagged. Because I know now that nothing flagged doesn't mean nothing's there. It just means the system decided, on its own, that whatever it saw wasn't worth showing me. I think about that a lot. Actually, more than the man himself. Weirdly, not him, the 11 seconds of footage that almost stayed unwatched forever. Filed quietly under a label that meant false alarm. Don't bother. Nothing here. Sitting in a folder none of us would ever have opened if my dad hadn't insisted. Out of nothing but stubbornness, that we look at everything instead of trusting the parts that had already been sorted out for us. I don't know what would have happened if we never found that clip. I don't know what almost time meant, or whether it was ever coming, or whether it already happened in some smaller way. I never noticed a night I slept through. A week I wasn't paying close enough attention. I don't have an ending for this one. I just have the 2 years since, and the habit of checking things twice, and the quiet, specific unease that comes from knowing your own name, said by a stranger at 4 a.m, to a camera he believed no one would ever watch. If this story kept you watching until the end, let me know in the comments what you think really happened. And if you've ever experienced something that still doesn't make sense to this day, I'd love to read about it. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy true horror stories like this. There's another one waiting for you on the screen right now. And trust me, it might make you look at your own home a little differently.